birth. Much of what has appeared since then in the American public sphere repeats these unfounded assertions, which, again, precisely mirror the founding myths of the Israeli state. It wasn't really until 4 decades after 1948 that the narrative that a few people had tried to put forth in the early 50s was thoroughly substantiated. The counter-narrative that a few people had put forward in the early 50s and 60s was thoroughly substantiated by research by the so-called Israeli new historians based on newly released documents from the Israel State Archives. Nothing in this litany of myth and distortion, in fact, was true. In the interim, much had been done to cement the mythology popularized by Exodus in the American public mind. During the 60s, moreover, there were important changes in the self-image of the American Jewish community and in American attitudes towards Israel. As the distinguished historian Peter Novick, who was my colleague at Chicago, showed in his brilliant book, The Holocaust and American Life, several factors increased the attachment to Israel of the American Jewish community during this period before 1967. One of them was the heightened prominence given to the Holocaust, which came to be seen as a central figure and is today still a central feature in American Jewish identity. Additionally, the 1967 war had a galvanizing effect on American Jewish attachment to Israel. It connected a whole generation that was coming of age at that time with Israel in a way that was different to what had come before. In part, this was a function of a new myth, which connected with increased awareness of the Holocaust. This myth was that on the eve of the June War, you're all familiar with this, faced with the possibility of another Holocaust at the hands, Israel was faced with the possibility of another Holocaust at the hands of the massed Arab armies. Among generations of Americans who reached maturity from that time, like myself, until now, this myth has achieved a near sacrosanct status. Most people believe this is true. This is the case, although all serious scholarship has shown that notwithstanding the very grave fears that both the Israeli public and the American Jewish community had, American and Israeli intelligence analysts, military and civilian, unanimously concurred that Israel would crush the Arab armies whether or not Israel attacked first. There is no analyst who disagreed with that at the time. We now know because the historical record is available, and that is an established fact. But these myths and the fears around them were brilliantly and ceaselessly exploited from then onwards in order to cement sympathy for Israel. The growing emphasis on the Holocaust and the increased identification with Israel have grown into what have now been institutionalized as central pillars of American Jewish identity in ways that were not true previously. Talk to very old people among you and ask them what was New York like in the 1940s. Not many people remember it. I was born in '48, so I certainly don't remember it. But I remember my parents telling me there were a lot of anti-Zionists. The New York Times was run by people who were anti-Zionist. You could go on and on and on and seeing a range of opinion in the American Jewish community which ceased to be there by the 60s or 70s. American Jewish identity has become much more focused on Israel than it ever was before, at a time when overt discrimination in the United States against Jews was declining. In the 60s, there were racial covenants in this city which prevented Jews from buying homes. Now, young people don't believe that I'm the truth of this, but anybody older than 50 or 60 knows that that's true. These things are gone. They've disappeared. And as a result of this and many other things, there was a much greater degree of communal self-confidence and assertiveness in this community. These shifts in the views of several generations of American Jews who came to maturity before and after '67 were mirrored by an important transformation in how American public opinion, or at least segments of it, came to view Israel. And that's what I want to talk about now. These are changes that were a result of the fact that our government, the U.S. government, was increasingly coming to see Israel for the first time as an ally, because it was seeing it for the first time again as a proxy in the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union and with its Arab clients in the region. This was not always the case. We think it was, but it wasn't. The United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side in 1947-48. They both supported the establishment of Israel. They were on the same side in 1956. They both opposed the tripartite aggression against Egypt. There was no Cold War alignment on one side and another of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel had not been considered to be a strategic asset to the United States by most American policymakers from 1947 right up through the mid-1960s. But by 1967, the United States had become completely aligned with Israel against the Arab states, most of which were supported by the USSR, in a configuration that in fact continued until the end of the Cold War. Israel has been considered a strategic asset ever since, but I'm trying to stress never was before that, even though it may be that there's currently some questioning of Israel's strategic value in some policymaking circles in this town today. I'll talk about that maybe in questions. Now, this was a shift, this alignment, this Cold War alignment with Israel, that was a long time in coming. And there are a number of points that you could choose as the tipping points. President Kennedy's delivery of the first U.S. military equipment directly to Israel in the early 60s, President Johnson's increasing alienation from Egypt, beginning not with the Arab-Israeli conflict, but beginning with the Yemen war and with American opposition to Egyptian involvement in the civil war in Yemen, starting in 1962. And finally, President Johnson's deep and abiding sympathy for Israel. This was derived partly from Johnson's long-standing, close, and in some cases intimate friendships with many major donors to the Democratic Party who were fervently pro-Israel. The impact of the Vietnam War was also a big factor in causing policymakers to see the Middle East in Cold War terms much starker than had been the case before. And the June War itself played a role in this closer American alignment with Israel. This resounding Israeli victory showed American policymakers who were deeply shaken at this time by Vietnam. Johnson was about to resign a year later because of Vietnam. This is before the Tet Offensive, but things were already going badly. It showed him and the people around him that Israel could serve American interests in opposing the Soviet Union. The defeat of the Soviet-supplied Arab armies provided a welcome triumph for the free world at a time when news from the Southeast Asian battlefields was bad. In the wake of this, American public opinion tended to follow the policymakers in looking at the Middle East. In general, there was a further demonization of the Arabs, and especially of the Palestinians and the PLO. The dominant narrative emphasized their alignment with the Soviet Union in the Cold War and their terrorist proclivities. These tropes have persisted in the rhetoric of our government, and especially in the rhetoric of our Congress ever since, and in fact are embedded in much of the media to this day. This continued to the end of the Cold War. After that, of course, the definition of terrorism was slightly modified to reflect the end of the evil empire, but the focus on Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim terrorism has remained a constant until the present day. Now, this was the situation until the end of the Cold War, and a little afterwards, I would say. In recent decades, I would argue, there have been some positive changes in the way the Palestine question has been perceived. The growth of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in the 60s, or the rebirth of this movement in the 60s, had an impact on a number of people. Although this movement was tarred by its opponents with the brush of terrorism, the human face of the Palestinians, which had previously been almost totally obscured, could be discerned for the first time in the American media, starting in the 70s and the 80s. Events in the Middle East, in my view, played a crucial role in this evolution. Notable among them was the 10-week Israeli siege and bombardment of Beirut in 1982, which killed 17,000 people, most of them civilians, and which shocked even Israel's staunch supporter, Ronald Reagan. You can go to the presidential archives in Simi Valley, as some of my students have done, and see some quite remarkable reactions on the part of one of the most pro-American, pro-Israeli administrations in history to what Israel was doing in Lebanon. Even more shocking to them were the Sabra and Shatila massacres. All of this, of course, was heavily covered by the U.S. media. I would argue that the 1982 roll was a seminal event and played a crucial role in changing American views of who was David and who was Goliath in the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians. The next stage in this evolution was the first Palestinian Intifada, which started in December 1987, and which strongly reinforced, because of the way in which it was covered, partly, this new sense in American public opinion of the Palestinians rather than the Israelis as underdogs. And if you look at the Israeli media, and if you look at the way in which the pro-Israel advocacy establishment in this country reacted to these events, you could sense an enormous frustration on their part. Stuff that they'd been able to get away with for decades suddenly wasn't flying, and a different narrative was being purveyed by the very same journalists who just more or less repeated whatever they wanted them to say out of Beirut or elsewhere, or out of West Bank villages where Israeli soldiers were beating up Palestinian kids. The Madrid-Oslo peace process, abortive though it was, in my view, which saw the PLO engaged in negotiations with Israel, furthered this process of humanizing the previously despised Palestinians. I would argue that a lot of this progress was undone by the impact of the Second Intifada beginning in 2000, especially by the suicide bombings that began a couple of years later against Israeli civilian targets. These events shocked Americans who were deeply affected in the wake of 9/11 by attacks on this city and on New York. And I think that the suicide bombings in Palestine, inside Israel rather, reestablished the perception of Palestinians as irrationally violent and hate-filled, and of Israelis as innocent victims and nothing else. Nevertheless, I would argue that in spite of these ups and downs, the space had already been opened up for more nuanced and balanced views of the conflict and of Palestinian and Israeli topics generally. The very term Palestine, which was once considered taboo by mainstream publishers, such was the success of the relentless Zionist and later Israeli effort to replace Palestine with Israel. Use of this term was now more acceptable and less controversial than had been the case previously. The result of this broad shift was the publication, really for the first time, of works in the mainstream trade press, of books that enabled Americans for the first time to have access to versions of Middle East realities which reflected a variety of conflicting perspectives, contrasting perspectives rather, not just the same old pro-Israeli slant. I would argue that an important role in this process, certainly in academia but also outside, was played by the publication of Israel's new historians, and also by the writing of a whole slew of iconoclastic Israeli scholars, Ami Ayalon, the late Baruch Kimmerling, Menachem Klein, Shaul Mishal, Avram Sela, Gabby Peterberg, the late Tanya Reinhardt, Shlomo Zand, Gershon Shafir, Zev Sternhell, Edith Zertal, Yael Zerubbabel. I could actually go on for half an hour with the names of Israeli scholars published in English, easily accessible, whose writings showed that the one-dimensional perspective offered by the Israeli state and its American apologists was much more impoverished than the broad range of views available within Israeli society itself. These were, in many cases, the most respected figures in Israeli academic life. Now, many other books published on aspects of the Palestine question recently have broadened the range of what's available. There's been an increased willingness on the part of trade publishers in particular, whose main concern is, understandably, sales and profit, and who shy away from certain kinds of acrid controversy, to consider publishing works that would previously have been considered too provocative to sell well. A reticence on this score, plus the blatant biases in favor of Israel of many people in the publishing industry, were always adduced as the reason that mainstream publishers would not touch works that presented another version of reality than the one emanating from a pro-Israeli perspective. But recently, President Carter's book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, and John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt's book on the Israeli lobby have been major publishing successes. The publishers actually made money on these books. They made a considerable amount of money on these books. They showed, as have a few other books, that it is possible to publish profitably works critical of the received pro-Israeli version of events. To this, in terms of the important elements in this change, I think, must be added the changing situation on U.S. campuses, where the situation of Palestine is concerned. Now, I went to university in this country. I was an undergraduate in this country, and I remember how difficult it was to say anything on campus in those days, where I went to school and other places. My brother was at Columbia, I was at Yale. I visited other campuses. It was very hard in those days, and it wasn't much easier in the 80s when I came back from Lebanon. But things are beginning to change, especially in the past decade. This was already clear to key figures in the Israel advocacy establishment as early as 2002, when the Jewish Telegraphic Agency published a remarkable article entitled, I'm quoting here, "Jewish Groups Coordinate Efforts to Help Students," in quotes, "take back campus." Now think about this headline, 2002. This article, and a slew of other articles at the time, indicated that these groups already felt in 2002 that U.S. campuses had been lost to them and had been won over to Palestinian advocacy. A growing disenchantment, and there was reason for them to feel this way, I think. Maybe not to the same extreme degree that they were suggesting in this alarmist article, but something was changing. A growing disenchantment among liberal young American Jews, especially college students, was, if you noticed it, the main burden of a remarkable article by Peter Beinart in the June 10th